Good evening. That must be Lois. I think I can hear her. For those of you who I've not met, I'm Duke Blackwood, and I'm the director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Before I introduce our special guest tonight, I ask that you please turn off your cell phones, your Blackberries, and your pagers so we don't disturb the audience. Now, once I introduce Mrs. Reagan and Jon Meacham, when they come in, will you please remain standing so we can do the Pledge of Allegiance without doing the bunny hop. Now, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the former First Lady of the United States of America, Mrs. Ronald Reagan, escorted by Jon Meacham. Now, in honor of the men and women who defend our freedom and our liberty, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. We are blessed here at the Reagan Library to have many in the community that we consider friends, and I'd like to recognize a few of those here this evening. First, the wife of our local congressman, Mrs. Janice Gallegly. Janice? Also protecting our freedoms are Ventura County Sheriff Bob Brooks, and some of our local officials, Gary Lowenberg, Michelle Foster, and Mike Siddell. And finally, on behalf of Mrs. Reagan, the Board of Trustees, and all of us who work here, I'd like to give a special recognition and thank you to all of our volunteers and docents who serve here. We genuinely appreciate everything that you do for us. Now, before we hear from our special guests, I want to make an important announcement as it relates to Mrs. Reagan. No, she will not be declaring herself as candidate for governor. It worked. It has to do with a very special recognition she will receive. Eureka College will be bestowing upon Mrs. Reagan an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from her husband's alma mater. The degree recognizes, very good. The degree recognizes Mrs. Reagan's distinguished record of public service, her work with children in the foster grandparent program, her Just Say No campaign, and her promotion of research for Alzheimer's disease, all of which have earned her international recognition and acclaim. And we are delighted to have representatives from the college here this evening. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize the president of Eureka College and his wife, Dr. and Mrs. David Arnold. And from their Board of Trustees, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Owen. It's great to have you all here this evening. Now, back in the year 2000, we began collecting magazines with either President or Mrs. Reagan on the cover. Considering their remarkable lives from Hollywood to Sacramento, from Washington to their travels abroad, the magazine covers were from across the country as well as around the world. I believe that there were some 1,200 at last count. Of that number, 54 were from NEWSWEEK, featuring Ronald Reagan on the cover, beginning almost exactly 43 years ago with a March 28, 1966 cover entitled Politics 66, and ending at that time with an October 4th, 1999 cover entitled In Search of Reagan. Of all the magazines we collected, NEWSWEEK was the second highest in terms of covers he was on. I won't tell you which one came in first, but I'll let you guess. Many of those covers have been framed, and now you can see them in our museum. After President Reagan's funeral in 2004, many magazines shared the story of our nation's loss. But one cover story especially comes to mind. Called American Dreamer, the story was a sweeping and intimate tribute to Ronald Reagan, written for NEWSWEEK by Jon Meacham. Discussing President Reagan's speech in Normandy in 1984 regarding the boys of Punta Hoc, Mr. Meacham wrote, quote, "Reagan was doing what he did best, making us believe in a vision of America as a beacon of light in a world of darkness, as the home of an essentially brave and good people." He ended his article once again turning to that light when he wrote, "His grave looks out towards the Pacific, where the sun sets on America every evening. It is still light there on the edge of the continent when darkness has fallen across the rest of the nation." Oh, how like Reagan, soaking up the last possible ray of the sun, savoring the day to the very end. The Ronald Reagan that John wrote about is still relevant today. I think I should repeat that. Ronald Reagan is still relevant today. His departure from the White House 20 years ago does not mean we should abandon the principles he championed, the beliefs he communicated, and his dedication to solving America's problems by transcending party politics, and most importantly, by providing true leadership. Here at the Reagan Library, we are working to continue Ronald Reagan's philosophy of leadership and dedication to country. As he said it best, the best is yet to come. John's tribute to President Reagan was truly heartfelt. But did you know that President Reagan also honored NEWSWEEK? In February of 1983, NEWSWEEK magazine celebrated its 50th anniversary. To commemorate the day, President Reagan spoke via satellite, technology was a lot different back then, to NEWSWEEK employees and members of the press. In his speech, he said, "The history of the magazine is one of invention and breakthrough. We Americans are very proud of NEWSWEEK and are pleased to point out that it began as a competitive twinkle in an entrepreneurial eye. Many weekly news magazines now bring insights and information to the public, but NEWSWEEK in particular can be proud that its keen competitive spirit has made it one of the most respected in its field today." And now here we are in 2009 celebrating the magazine's 76th anniversary. And NEWSWEEK is still going strong, thanks in part to our guest tonight. John became editor of NEWSWEEK in October of 2006, after serving as managing editor since November of 1998. He has supervised their coverage of politics, international affairs, and of breaking news. John has written cover stories on politics and religion, guns in America, race, and of course, the passing of President Reagan. In 2001, he was key in the editing of the magazine coverage of the September 11th attacks. What you might not know is John is also a best-selling author. His 2003 book, Franklin and Winston, An Intimate Portrait of an Epic Friendship, was named Los Angeles Times Book of the Year and won the Churchill Center's 2005 Emory Reeves Award for the best work on Winston Churchill that year. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and honor to welcome Jon Meacham.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Reagan. I'm honored to be here. I realize that having a journalist from the East is a kind of diversity hire for you all. It is an acceptable form of affirmative action, and I take that responsibility quite seriously. NEWSWEEK, whenever news magazines put a question mark on a cover, the answer is almost always yes quickly or no quickly. In 1967, the second time Governor Reagan, appeared on the cover of Newsweek, it simply said, Ronald Reagan, rising star in the West, ? Yeah, that worked out for the president and for the country. I'm struck by the recollection of the president speaking to that gathering in 1983, which he did, I'm almost certain, as a favor to the Reagan's great friend, Katharine Graham, whom we miss all the time, who once, her husband, Phil Graham, used to describe Newsweek as the first rough draft of history. And whenever we would make a mistake, on those few occasions, one or two, Mrs. Graham would call, usually on Monday morning after a senator or a congressman or perhaps a president had called in to call this mistake to her attention. And an editor taking the Mrs. Graham call that Monday morning once said, well, ma'am, it's just supposed to be the first rough draft of history. And she said, yeah, but it doesn't have to be so goddamn rough. That's a true story. I was not the editor. I was nearby. The Newsweek has turned 76 years old just a month or so ago. I think President Reagan would want us to point out it's the 37th anniversary of our 39th birthday. I am honored to be here for many reasons. Chiefly, the life and work of Ronald Reagan will, as Winston Churchill said in another context, be spoken of as long as the English language survives in any corner of the globe. What he did in the 1980s and throughout his life made our world possible in a very direct and tactile way. I have just spent an enormous number of years worried about Andrew Jackson, a man whose portrait hung in Ronald Reagan's Oval Office. And so I'd like to connect the two briefly for a moment, if I may. 27 Marches ago, in 1982, the second year of his presidency, President Reagan flew from the White House to Nashville, Tennessee, to commemorate Andrew Jackson's birthday by laying a wreath at Jackson's grave and addressing the Tennessee state legislature. Several people were unindicted in that audience, which made it remarkable in my home state. That is not always the case where I come from. I'm sorry, this is in honor of President Reagan, a quick story. Where I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a chief of police was once indicted for, I'm sure, trumped-up charges of corruption, and he was acquitted. And he then immediately ran for re-election, arguing, I've been declared innocent by a court of law. Have you been declared innocent by a court of law? He died in office. For Reagan to go to Tennessee in 1982 to claim Jackson's mantle was a typical bit of Reagan-esque political magic. Only the founder of the modern Republican Party would have the audacity and the skill to go claim the mantle of the founder of the Democratic Party, and no one would look askance. This is what President Reagan said on that day in 1982. Andrew Jackson was the first American president to be born in a log cabin. He spoke for the average citizen and fought the vested interests. It was Jackson who reminded us that one man with courage makes a majority. Throughout his stormy life, he lived by that motto, defending his honor, our union, and the inalienable rights of every citizen, regardless of station. Jackson said, great is the stake placed in our hands, great is the responsibility which must rest upon the people of the United States. And President Reagan concluded saying, those were Andrew Jackson's words, but they still ring true. You and I have come to office in a time of crisis for our country, but we're working our way out of an inherited economic mess that is the worst this country has seen in 40 years. Ronald Reagan knew something about governing in times of crisis. He led the nation and the free world in hours of maximum danger, when the threat of nuclear war was real and even growing. He belongs to a great tradition of presidential leadership, one stretching from Washington, who invented the office, to Jackson, who strengthened it, to Lincoln, who rescued it, to Franklin Roosevelt, who reinvented it. Whether the incumbent president, our 44th, already a man of history, will rise to the challenges of this hour, and take his place in that pantheon of presidents is an open question. It's too soon to tell. It is not too soon, though, to look back, however briefly, to other times and other trials in search of lessons that might help us now. Winston Churchill once remarked that the future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope, an optimistic vision of politics and power, very much in keeping with the spirit of the man in whose library we stand. So how to define crisis? I'm reminded of then Governor Reagan's remark that a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, a depression is when you lose yours, and a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his. He said that 29 years ago, and you're still laughing. Ronald Reagan is really the Homer of political expression. It will be quoted forever. Crisis. From the Greek, a crisis is a time of testing, a moment in which things can go irrevocably one way or irrevocably another. In medicine, it can be a matter of life and death. In politics, it can mean the difference between the desirable and the disastrous. There are, in my view, three essential characteristics of leadership in crisis: courage, candor, and cooperation. But before going on, I'd like to add a personal word, if I may. I would not be doing what I am doing, either at NEWSWEEK or in writing history, if it were not for Ronald Reagan. Given that I never had the opportunity to meet him, something I regret beyond measure, this may sound odd, but such is the power of leadership when exercised by men of grace and skill. He was the president of my childhood and was to me what Franklin Roosevelt was to so many Americans and what John F. Kennedy was to yet so many more, the vivid figure at the center of the national story. For me, President Reagan made politics appealing and even seductive by defining the work of our lives as the preservation of what he so often called the last best hope of man on earth. He invested the American saga with the highest and grandest of stakes. And like Lincoln, he summoned the better angels of our nature. Mrs. Reagan, may I take the liberty of saying that the United States of America and the world at large owe your husband a debt we cannot repay. My children, who have been born in the long shadow of the age of Reagan, live in a better, brighter, and safer world because of him. And please know that Americans down to the last generation will honor his name and cherish his memory. And for making so much of what he did possible, we owe you, too, our eternal gratitude. He once said, "You saved his soul," and he saved all of us. So thank you. Now, I'd like to take each of the qualities I mentioned a moment ago and see what history tells us about each. Courage, Aristotle once said, is the essential virtue, for it guarantees all the others. Without it, all else fails, whether it's the bravery of a young man or woman in combat, or of a president weighing great matters of state, the ability of an individual to impose his will on history, to bend reality his way in the service of the good, is what makes the great great and pushes us all forward. Whether it was Washington at Valley Forge, Lincoln and the crisis of the Union, FDR and Churchill and the Nazi threat, or Reagan and the Cold War, Our lives are shaped by those with the guts to go against the grain, to buck conventional wisdom, and to choose the hard over the easy. My favorite example of courage in the middle of the 20th century comes not from America, but from London, where Winston Churchill stood alone against Hitler. We can claim credit because Churchill's mother was American, and therefore the better part of him. On the 4th of June, 1940, after the miracle at Dunkirk, Churchill gave a speech that convinced Franklin Roosevelt and many others that perhaps Churchill was worth making a bet on. We forget in the mists of history that Churchill did not come to power as the last lion. He came to power on Friday, the 10th of May, 1940. He said that I felt as if I were walking with destiny and all my life had been but preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I should not fail. No one else on earth was sure he should not fail. When word came of Churchill's rise to the prime ministership, FDR was meeting with his cabinet on Friday afternoon in Washington. He was handed the telegram. He looked at it, looked up, and told the entire cabinet, "Well, I suppose Churchill is the best man England has, even if he is drunk half the time." My thought about that is rather like what Lincoln said about Grant: "If that's what it takes, send a case of whiskey to all my generals." But here's what Churchill said in a speech that convinced Roosevelt that he had rather more on his hands to conjure with than simply a man with an understandable appetite for strong drink, I think. This is what Churchill said: "Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world in all its power and might shall step forth to the rescue and liberation of the old." It was the urtext of modern courage. It begins with absolute defiance, and it ends with a prayer and a recognition that he might need help, and that if he could communicate the centrality of the shared values between London and Washington and across the country, then we could save our country and our way of life. It was enormously important. It's appropriate in a library devoted to a man who at critical hours used words to bend history, whether it was the Brandenburg Gate or an auditorium in New Hampshire in 1980 on a long ago evening. Always able to articulate the generalized feeling of a people and see a precise and tactical way forward. Not just the poetry's wonderful, but the strength of Churchill, the strength of Reagan, the strength of Jackson, the strength of Lincoln, was there was poetry, but there was always a plan in prose ready to go. Anyone can make fine speeches. It takes a great man, a great woman, to make a fine speech and then make something happen. And that's one element of courage and ability. President Reagan's courage in naming the Soviet threat for what he believed it was, evil, is another example. Establishment Washington and New York blanched. The area code in which I live, zip code in which I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, they're still trying to recover from it in many ways. He said, "What?" Pass the martinis. But Reagan was right, and history will always remember him for his bravery in framing the struggle against totalitarianism, not just as an economic, political, or strategic one, but as a moral one. Candor is also essential in times of crisis. Tell the people the truth, and we'll do what it takes. It's the covenant of modern democracies. Churchill again. In the winter of 1942, things were going miserably. Pearl Harbor had happened. We were a long way away from Midway. Singapore had fallen. The Prince of Wales had been sunk. America was only beginning to do baby steps toward being ready to fight. And Churchill was under enormous pressure, political pressure in London. Sounds somewhat familiar. Parliament was after him. And so he gave a long speech, 10,000 words, wrote it himself, in which he laid out the state of the war. And he later said that he believed the British people could face any misfortune with buoyancy and hope, as long as they are convinced that those who are in charge of their affairs are not deceiving them, or are not themselves dwelling in a fool's paradise. Or not themselves dwelling in a fool's paradise. Be straightforward about the challenges, and a democratic people will answer that challenge. Roosevelt did the same thing. He said, and Roosevelt had a much more, how to put it, ambivalent relationship with the truth in many ways. You can ask Mrs. Roosevelt about that. But that's another sermon for another day. Should have said that, sorry. He said that winter that the news is going to get worse and worse before it gets better and better, and the American people deserve to have it straight from the shoulder. He quoted Thomas Paine. President Reagan loved to quote Thomas Paine, saying, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Roosevelt chose another one from the same pamphlet, Common Sense, published in 1776, one of the great bestsellers in American history, in which he said, "Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered." Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. When President Reagan spoke of mankind's difficult journey from the swamp to the stars, and while optimistic, he was realistic too. He spoke in wonderful terms about that journey, but he was a realist. One of the things I think is wildly underappreciated about Ronald Reagan is the fact that he was the only Union president ever to become president of the United States. That upsets everyone. It upsets the entrepreneurs, it upsets the unions, but that's one of the great things he did. He confounded them all. What do labor negotiators do? First, you want a deal, otherwise you're not a very good negotiator. That's one thing. The other is you ask for something seemingly outlandish and you settle for half. It's what negotiating is about. So what did Reagan do? In 1981, he refers to the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. They reserve unto themselves the right to lie, to cheat, to steal. Again, people in my zip code go bananas. What happens 7 years later, in no small part because of the influence of Mrs. Reagan? What happened? We signed the first genuine reduction in nuclear arms, and he is embracing Soviet people in Red Square, received as a hero in what he called, in that wonderful phrase, that Moscow Spring. They went from being evil, he scared them, which is what negotiators do, and they worked it out. The great warmonger, remember he was going to lead us to war, it was going to be awful. What did he do? He became the peacemaker because he knew how to do it and to be candid within those negotiations. Trust but verify are words that echo down the years. I try to use them in my marriage as often as possible. I have no idea what that means, but my wife's not here, you can tell. And finally, cooperation is absolutely essential. It's not a mistake that it requires two wings for us to fly. Alliances at home and abroad are critical. Churchill once said the only thing worse than having allies is not having them. And one of the, I think, central things in the American experience has been our capacity to take one-time enemies and turn them into friends. And it requires an enormous amount of imagination to do that. Again, President Reagan did it with Gorbachev. Once the Soviets stopped dying on him, as you remember, it took him forever to meet one. It wasn't his fault. It was the respiration problem. Will the 44th president exercise the kind of leadership in this crisis that we need? I think the signs are good. I think President Obama is a student of history and a fair student of President Reagan. He knows that Reagan used the virtues we've talked about to change the direction of America in a deep and fundamental way. You may remember when Obama committed what Michael Kinsley defined as a gaffe in Washington, is when you tell the truth by accident. When he said that President Reagan had changed the country fundamentally and President Clinton had not. Not a big moment in the Clinton household that night. Can almost hear Clinton say, "He said what?" Although, don't you think it's one? I think they're doing a very good job of keeping both Biden and Clinton kind of chained up somewhere. So whatever they're doing, maybe that's what they're using Guantanamo for. I shouldn't leave the East. I should stay there. Obama is candid, and he believes in cooperation in a deep and fundamental way. The test is whether he has the courage and the raw political talent to bend the world to his wishes. My bet is that he does. One does not become the first African-American president of the United States at the age of 47 without being made of very stern stuff. As he and we go forward, I think we ought to remember the words President Reagan attributed to Andrew Jackson. One man with courage makes a majority. Reagan and Jackson and Roosevelt, both of them, all had that courage. But even more important, they believed that the rest of us did too, that the people were at heart virtuous and fair-minded. Great leaders can only emerge from great nations, and nations are made great by the goodness of their people. St. Augustine once defined a nation as an association of rational beings united in the common agreement as to the objects of their love. An association of rational beings united by a common agreement as to the objects of their love. And what do Americans love? We love liberty and faith and hope. We're bound together one to another, the living and the dead, by ties of affection and grace and sacrifice, and the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. Leadership is about reminding us of those truths, of lifting our eyes from the immediate to the sweeping, from the present to the future, from the temporal to the eternal. I think it's no mistake that two of the most transformative leaders of the 20th century both began their lives as actors. Ronald Reagan and John Paul II were able to point the way to a reality that the rest of us couldn't immediately see, to show us what it would be like and to show us how to get there. In that sense, the drama of their lives became the drama of nations and the drama of the world. On that long ago day in Tennessee, when President Reagan spoke of President Jackson, he concluded with these words: "In this time when we and our people are so severely tested, it will help to remember the courage that President Jackson could summon from the convictions in his heart." Let us, too, you and I, now, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, remember the courage of Ronald Reagan and the convictions of his heart. "We are too great a nation," he once said, "to limit ourselves to small dreams." He was right then, and he's right now. Just a final word. Not far from where we stand, Ronald Reagan lies buried facing west, always, always west, to the possibilities of the country and of politics and of humanity. It's, as Duke said, when it's dark everywhere else in America, it's light right here. And who else but Ronald Reagan could have found a place to savor every last ray of sun until the very end? Thank you very much.
You can stay up here. We're going to do the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
We need more people from the East like you coming out West. Jon has graciously accepted to take a few questions from the audience, but as usual, we will be taping this. So I ask that you raise your hand, and when I select you, wait till the microphone gets to you so we can grill him on the other side of the media chain. So who has the first question here? No questions? All right, I'm going to start with a question then.
Yes, sir.
Ronald Reagan took office. He was known as the great communicator.
Right.
The media was a very different institution back then. Compare and contrast what Ronald Reagan faced in the early 1980s to what President Obama is facing today, and where have the changes, and have those changes been good, bad, or indifferent?
That's a wonderful question. I wish I knew the answer. I want to give a counterintuitive answer, perhaps. When you read the president's diaries, or you go back and read, as I recommend you do because it's really fun, read old issues of Time and Newsweek. You want to spend a happy spring afternoon, that's a way to do it. I'm a very exciting date, you can imagine. It hasn't changed that much. Ronald Reagan and Jim Baker and ultimately Howard Baker were always concerned about the news cycle. They were worried about, President Reagan, but his staff was, because there was a rhythm to a Washington week. Time and Newsweek and U.S. News came out on Monday. They had, I'm sorry to say, a tiny bit more influence then than they do now, just a little. The Sunday shows were enormously important. What was in the Washington Post was enormously important. CNN and the cable chatter culture began in the Reagan years. So I think the idea that there was a bucolic moment where, Scotty Reston wore his fedora and they had careful meetings about this, the merits of different throw weights, I think is a myth. The reason President Reagan had to be called the great communicator is because he had to communicate all the time, because even though the internet wasn't there, at the time it seemed as though the media marketplace was quite crowded. Television stations were growing, USA Today came along, talk radio was beginning in the way we know it. So I try to resist sometimes in my job what I call superlativitis, this idea that everything today is the most this or the worst that. He communicated, and he later, wonderfully in the farewell address, you'll remember he sort of said, well, I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. I'll take him half right. The first part was a little bit like Tom Sawyer and the Fence. If he wasn't, boy, I don't want to see someone who is. I mean, it's just so amazing. But he had to do that to get around Congress, to get around people who had jobs like mine, in order to talk to the people. There are still lobbyists in Washington who remember his first major speech on the tax bill in 1981, where he said, send telegrams. And Congress had never seen anything like this. And so clearly he recognized that there was a problem that he had to address by making his case explicitly to the people. I think President Obama, more so than perhaps President Clinton, but more so than any president since then, understands that lesson. Obama is in constant communication, not only with his supporters, but with everyone else. I think he's on the Home Shopping Network tonight. Anything for a stimulus. And people like me are sort of smart-alecky about it and say, oh, he's overexposed. But, people like it. You may remember in 1995, President Clinton he'd just been wiped out in the midterms, gave a State of the Union address that just ended yesterday. Do you remember this? It went on for days. And the press panned it. His numbers went way up because they were communicating directly with him. So I think the media environment, for Obama, the media environment is much more partisan and quick. That is, it's sulfurous. Because anytime anyone says anything, it lights up the blogosphere, one way or the other. And that's different. But that's a matter of speed as opposed to substance. And I think that's what's different. I think speed is different. I think the actual substantive sense that a politician attempting to implement an agenda has obstacles over which must be overcome is a perennial issue. Andrew Jackson, just very quickly, Andrew Jackson thought this, and so he founded his own newspaper. It would have been like President Bush founding Fox News or President Obama founding NPR. So,
you mentioned superlativitis, okay, and you also mentioned the overexposure. I had lunch today with a gentleman from a very successful business, a successful foundation, and unsolicited, he said, Obama is just way overexposed. I can't believe that he's going on the Tonight Show and doing all this stuff. He's not effectively using the media like previous presidents. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I completely disagree. I completely disagree. And it's not a partisan point. It's a clinical point. Mrs. Reagan used primetime situation comedies to get her anti-drug message out. The fact that I remember that, frankly, a quarter century, seriously, it's a very effective thing. You hunt where the ducks are, as we say in my... And the ducks are on Jay Leno. I mean, I'm sorry. I wish the ducks were all at NEWSWEEK, but the numbers don't back it up. We do a lot of quacking, but...
I'm going to move on to another question on that one. The gentleman back there, the young guy with the gray hair.
That's something I aspire to.
Thank you very much, Duke. Sir, I would like to thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, sir.
However, I would like to...
There's always a however.
Yes. I cannot share your confidence in our current president, President Barack Obama, and maybe you can explain to me the differences between President Reagan and Barack Obama in the sense that President Obama in 60 days has spent more money, tax money, than all 43 presidents combined before him in order to solve a crisis that I think he's making worse, versus what President Reagan did when he came in with a situation more serious than today, actually, I believe. And what did he do? He reduced taxes and cut spending, and a recovery came almost overnight. In fact, Europe leaders even said, how did you do it? Can you compare the two opposite points of view in trying to solve a crisis, please?
Now, our docents have their talking points down perfectly.
Exactly. I think you'll get free coffee tomorrow. There's an apples and oranges problem here, but it's all fruit, so let's talk about it. President Reagan inherited, as we talked about, the worst economic situation in 40 years. In 1981, he ultimately passed the Kemp-Roth bill. He signed it in August, I think, at the ranch. And we continued to have, as you know, a very severe recession, to the point where the 1982 midterms were disastrous for the Republicans. By 1983, the policies you articulate had kicked in and had begun to work, in my view. I suspect some of you may share that. And it set the stage for a remarkable decade or so of prosperity. But it was some short-term pain for long-term gain, and he talked about that. He never argued that there was a magic bullet for this, that there was an overnight thing. We're reversing 40 years or more of what he believed to be an inversion of American values and a steady encroachment on free enterprise. So I don't think there's any argument about President Reagan's achievements in the economic realm. It is also true that Ronald Reagan was one of the most practical and effective politicians in American history. He picked his fights very carefully. The federal government I hope nothing falls on me. Or maybe it's a trap door. The federal government grew 7% from 1981 to 1989. Why did that happen? Because the political nature of the country was such that that's what the people wanted. And Reagan did everything he could to implement his vision. He fundamentally, as Senator Obama said, changed the course of American politics in the way Franklin Roosevelt did. We live in a world Ronald Reagan created. Everyone since him has had to either attempt to build on his legacy or try to undo it. You can't be neutral on the Reagan legacy. And that's true of Obama, too, even at this distance, with 20 years from his leaving office. What I would urge, what I would suggest, what I'm doing in my own head, is trying to give Obama some time, because as St. Paul taught us in another context, being patient in tribulation is a virtue. And there's a lot of tribulation. I live in New York, as I said. I live on the Upper East Side. I take my children to kindergarten, and you've never seen so many ashen faces and terrified parents. It started at Wall Street. It spread. We are in the number of people whose lives and whose economic destinies have been turned upside down, perhaps changed forever in the past 6 to 8 months, is unprecedented since the 1979 to 81 period. So this is serious. These are serious times. I don't think Obama is a closet socialist. I don't think he's some sort of radical a sleeper agent. I just don't think any of that's true. I think he's a very careful and deliberate man. I hope he is. And I'll say this. I did not, as a journalist, I did not drink the Obama Kool-Aid last year. I think that if he tries to walk across the Potomac to Arlington, his feet might get wet. That puts me in a minority of journalists, I acknowledge. But I think whatever your partisan affiliation, wherever you stand, the scope of the problems that are not all George Bush's fault, that are, you can't be for the market and for the American way when it's all going well and say we should all share in this, and then when it goes poorly, you can't say, oh, it's all those bankers. Can't do that. We took those mortgages. We have these credit cards. Ronald Reagan would be the first person to say that it's collective responsibility, it's individual responsibility. It's going to take a long time to unring this bell. And so I just, again, wherever you stand, however you vote, I think all of us want this man to succeed, because if he succeeds, then we succeed. People stop getting thrown out of work. People stop having their dignity crushed. And we can get back to doing what we do best.
All right. Wayne.
I wanted to take advantage of your self-description of being willing to take the first rough cut at history.
Yes, sir.
If someone had told me a week ago that the federal government would fire the CEO of General Motors, and at least at my hearing, say that they thought they knew how to run the company better than the executives, I would have just said never would have happened. Right. So how does the editor of Newsweek help us make sense of this?
Well, I don't want it to be too goddamn rough, as Mrs. Graham would say. I recommend strong drink. We are in uncharted waters here. Even Truman didn't do it. When Truman was nationalizing everything, even he didn't do this. But this is an interesting development, and in a Reagan context. President Reagan believed, famously, the government's the problem, not the solution. But I'd argue that he meant that in a particular way at a particular time. Was that a universal principle? I don't think so, because he didn't believe that in terms of the military, didn't believe that in terms of basic pieces of the social contract that he did a great deal to preserve, despite, remember, here's what he was supposed to do. He was going to throw all the old people off Social Security, take away their health care, and then get us into a nuclear war. Maybe not in that order, but this is what was going to happen in 1980. Remember that speech? If you haven't, go home and look at it. If you don't, President Carter's renomination speech in Madison Square Garden is a remarkable piece of political hyperbole from an incumbent president, even given the political. Now, he was chasing Ted Kennedy around, and he had a lot on his mind that night. But it's a really remarkably negative speech, and I just recommend that to get a sense of politics did not just get unkind recently. I don't know what I would have done if I had the choice of changing the leadership of General Motors. There are a lot of institutions that I think need new leadership. Is it the appropriate role of the government when a company absolutely requires your money and my money to survive? Perhaps. If it doesn't work, we know who to blame, in part. I mean, General Powell said in a different context, if you break it, you own it. Obama now owns most of industrialized America and all the banks. So we're going to know, and to go to your point, sir, we're going to know way before next November, November 10, whether this has worked. And he's exercising emergency leadership in a time of crisis, and I honestly don't know if it's going to work. Do I think it's appropriate? I think the test of whether something is appropriate or not begins to fall apart when companies are absolutely dependent, not just on getting a tax break or here's a little bridge loan till payday, but billions and billions, their very survival. Their survival is entirely in the hands of the federal government. As part of a covenant, as part of personal responsibility, does that mean that the president understandably has the right on the council of his advisors to suggest that perhaps the man who took the price from $70 a share to $2.70 might not be the right guy? I could make that case. To me, the larger question, the first rough draft of history here, is to what extent are we comfortable with a mixed economy? And it's really being put before us in very stark ways. The economy's always been somewhat mixed, but the expansion of the state in the role of the hitherto private economy is unprecedented, I guess arguably since the Second World War. And so what I would hope we all do politically and culturally is maturely set some kind of time frame to then look and see whether it worked. If unemployment keeps going up, if these companies are ultimately end up in bankruptcy anyway, and if, as I am sure as I'm standing here, there are going to be more bonus problems, there's going to be more populist outrage. Too much of that money was sloshing around at the end of last year not to have that happen. We need to find a moment where we say, this worked, this didn't, you're accountable now, sir. You broke it, you own it.
That would be November of 2010 for our election cycle. We would love to have more questions, but unfortunately our time is tight tonight, so we've got to catch a plane. But we want to thank you for your wonderful remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And again, I want to thank the docents and the volunteers for your great work here. It's great to have you here this evening. And I ask that you remain standing or seated until we can get Mrs. Reagan out to upstairs and enjoy the evening and your dinner. Thank you.